to keep that in the forefront of our minds. Question 4 says, did the Old Testament teach that men were to love their neighbor as themselves? And I think we just answered that. So in what ways does a person show that they love themselves? How would you show that you love yourself?
Taking care of yourself at the basic level.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, you as the New Testament states, you don't hate your own body, but you care for your own body. If you begin to get sick, you take medicine, you take vitamins. If you hurt yourself, you go to the doctor to heal the injury. You take care of your body. You put time, you put care into yourself, and so taking care of our neighbor is no different. In looking to the needs of others, this is where love comes into play. That to love outside of myself, I have to love others like myself. I can't put myself first all the time, but I have to put the thoughts and the needs of others in that place. Now, how does that then relate to our neighbors? We understand that among Christians, right? I think everyone here can agree that we love each other and that we do things to show that to one another. We try to help each other and care for each other. How does that relate to the world then? Because we're not really talking about the church here. That's going to be the next lesson. What connection are we trying to make to our neighbor? Who is our neighbor?
Pretty much everybody.
Everybody, right? Essentially, everyone that we come in contact with, and even people that we haven't come in contact with yet. The idea is that every person is our neighbor, right? Whenever Jesus had that situation, with the young lawyer, where the lawyer tries to stump him, and he says, "Well, who is my neighbor?" Jesus brings this to light. So, what relationship then do we have to our neighbor if we're to love them as ourselves?
To take care of them.
Okay, so this is where it gets messy. What do we do about that often?
Ignore them.
What do we do? What do we do about taking care of others that are outside the body, outside the church?
I think we categorize those people, right? We have the people that we worship with, those who are in the church. We take care of those, hopefully, to the level that God expects us to. And then those acquaintances that we have outside of the church, we could have a close relationship with them, so we're going to take care of them a little bit more. But I think where it really hits home is those strangers that you were talking about, and the stranger that I think was mentioned in the Good Samaritan. He didn't know that guy at all. He didn't know from Adam's house cat. And yet,
right,
what did he do for him? He took care of him to the extent that we would probably take care of someone that we loved and cared about.
That's right. This is the question that often gets asked whenever a situation arises. 2 weeks ago we had the tornadoes that ripped through Nashville, and we all understand the travesty of what that did and the damage that was done. And as people started talking about sending aid and sending relief, one of the common questions that comes up often within the church is, well, these people that you're helping, that you're sending money to, are they Christians? And I think that's something we're going to talk about in the next lesson. We're going to talk about our relationship to the church as Christians. But individually as Christians, we don't, sometimes because we say, well, the church is not a soup kitchen, right? I mean, we're all familiar with that phrase, right? Where we say, well, the church doesn't have authority to, feed everybody or to shelter the homeless or to do all these things. But we're not talking about the church here. We're talking about the Christian's relationships to his neighbor, which would be everybody. Maybe the church does not have, we'll talk about that in the next lesson. Maybe the church does not have the authority to feed the homeless and shelter the homeless and to help, just arbitrarily. But as Christians, we're given that, not only that command, but we have the authority to do so. It is well within our means that if we're able to help, we should help. And that is, in essence, an outpouring of love. Ultimately, Jesus for people that he would never meet while he was here on earth. I mean, Jesus never met me while because I wasn't alive then. I would say that that's a different relationship now. But he died for me long before I was ever even here. And he'll die for people that are yet to be born, that will hopefully, come to an understanding and want to enter a relationship with him. But the point is that our relationships with our neighbors aren't limited like that of the church. And so whether someone's a Christian or not, whether someone is even someone or not, if we're able to help, I think that there's a responsibility there in the command and in the example of the Good Samaritan to do so. Any thoughts on that?
I agree.
So question number 7 says, what was Jesus' point in telling the story of the rich man and Lazarus? What's the ultimate point Jesus is making there? Between the rich man and Lazarus. Did y'all go over that last week?
No, we did not.
Okay, all right. So let's look at that really quick. Let's see. All right, look at Luke chapter 12. Luke chapter 12. All right, so verse 13 says, someone in the crowd said to him, Teacher, tell my brother to divide his inheritance with me. But he said to him, Man, who made you a judge or arbitrator over you? And he said to them, Take care, be on your guard against all covetous, for one's life does not consist of the abundance of his possessions. And he told them a parable, saying, The land of a rich man produced plentifully, and he thought to himself, What shall I do? I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, Fool, this night your soul shall be required of you. The things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself is not rich toward God. What's the difference between that story and Lazarus, who was laid at the gate begging for crumbs? What's the difference in mentality that are noticeable there?
Lazarus was poor, but it's about a rich man.
Okay. So say that one more time so I can hear.
I said Lazarus was poor, but this parable is about a rich man.
Okay. So Lazarus was poor. Lazarus was poor. And he was begging for crumbs that fell from the rich man's table. But in Luke chapter 12, this rich man had goods laid up for years, but he didn't have any to help the needy. And it said that he was not rich towards God. So does this really have anything to do with money?
No, it's our attitude towards it.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily about somebody being rich or somebody being poor. We're talking about a a belief system, a mindset that says, I'm going to do something no matter the cost. Obviously, we wouldn't do ourselves any good if we spent, everything that we had to help somebody else and then put ourselves in that same predicament that we just got them out of. But there is a sense in which we should give all that we can to help. And it's not about giving money. I mean, it can be time, right? It doesn't have to be money. It can be time. Sometimes you get that phone call at 10:45 at night and you're just about to lay down and go to bed, and you think to yourself, well, maybe this can wait till morning. A couple weeks ago, my phone was blowing up, and it was Josh Kelly. And so, I'm looking at my phone and I'm thinking, do I really want to take this phone call? It's 9:30. And, in the end, he was just telling me that his dad had died. And I'm glad that I took the call, because had I not taken the call, he wouldn't have had the opportunity to tell me that and me to talk to him for a few minutes, And I think that, it's one of those things that we have opportunities every day that aren't centered around money to care for our neighbor, to show our neighbor concern. It's not necessarily about money, but it's about time. It's about our talents, what we can give in those areas. But it's not necessarily about rich people and poor people, or about giving all the time, but it's about showing and expressing that love for our neighbor as ourselves. So what did James have to say about loving one's neighbor? In James chapter 1, and if you get there before me, feel free to read it. James chapter 1, verse 27.
Okay. Pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world.
All right, so there's three things there. All right. He said, visit orphans and widows in their affliction. So to visit orphans and visit widows. And that's not necessarily one act. Those are two separate acts. We can visit orphans, visit widows, and then to keep oneself unstained from the world. I don't know that we consider the first part of that as much as we do the last part. Well, I think we all take very seriously the keeping oneself unstained from the world aspect, or I hope we do. But what about visiting orphans and widows? That was a literal situation going on then. But what about now? What is he saying there when he's saying, visit them, show up for a visit? What's the implication that he's getting at?
Do what you can to help out, take care of them.
Yeah, be involved ultimately, right? He's not saying, just go up and show up for a visit necessarily, but be involved. Be involved with the ones who need help. In the first century, orphans and widows would be absolutely destitute, right? Because it was a male-dominated society then, where much of your status in society was based on the husband, the father. If the husband or father was no longer in the picture and wasn't the one to take that burden, many times the widows and the orphans just kind of went by the wayside. Didn't even really get considered much. And James recognized, based on Jesus' teachings back that we looked at in the Gospels, that this was not to be. And so it's not necessarily just about visiting them, not showing up for a visit, like a social visit, although I'm sure that's part of it. But really what he's getting at is be involved with these widows and these orphans. If it's a fatherless child, as men, we have a responsibility to be involved in that child's life to some degree. That's much of what our church relationship is about as a community of believers, is to be involved in one another's lives so that we have a support system. But in regards to outside the church, even, to what opportunities could be presented by visiting or getting involved with widows and kids without fathers? What opportunities could be presented?
Be an example for children. Be an example for the children, the orphans.
Say it again.
Be an example
for the children, right? I mean, who knows what they might learn? You know, they might, you know, what you're hoping for is an opportunity to share the gospel. You know, and being an example, like you said, Carlos, I think being an example is a great way to influence someone to listen to you. It's amazing when you consider evangelism as a whole. Becky Duncan says encouragement. That's a good point also. Chris just sent me the definition of visit. It's to look upon or after, to inspect and examine with the eyes in order to see how he is. Visit, to go see one, the poor and afflicted, the sick, to look upon in order to help and benefit, look after, to have and care for. There we go. To have and care for, provide for. Of God, to look about for, to choose, to employ, etc. That's exactly it. When you consider evangelism, we understand the mechanics of evangelism, right? Go share the gospel. Becky said encouragement. That's absolutely part of that, right? In 2 Corinthians 5:11, Paul says, because of fear of the Lord, we persuade others. When you consider what persuasion is, so much of being able to persuade someone is wrapped up in your influence over them. And as a Christian in my relationship to my neighbor, who may or may not be a believer, I have a responsibility to influence them. That's one of the things that as Christians we have to recognize, is that so much of our discipleship is about to be a good influence on society, to be a good influence on our community, but also to be a good influence on those who could be taught the gospel. People are 9 times more likely to listen to you if you have an influence over them. Robbie? Go ahead, Robbie.
The transition isn't real smooth between us talking. That's why I kind of raised my hand. But what Chris said, I think, to be the good example that others need, when you have that widow situation or that orphan situation, there's a void there. Whenever there's a void, those situations are looking for something to fill that void with. And you can be that filler. You can be that example. You can be that Christ-like witness to them, that they can fill that void with Christ, where those people of the world may take them in a different direction and keep leading them away. So I think Chris had a good point. Kind of expanded my thoughts a little bit on that.
That's exactly. I think you're exactly right. Our example is everything, and our example becomes very limited if we don't get involved with people. Okay, so I'm getting messages from everybody to unless you're going to talk, keep your mic muted so we don't get feedback. But then whenever you want to talk, just unmute it or raise your hand like Robbie did so I can see you. And that way we can avoid the feedback. Is it gone? Everybody? All I got is Brian and Robbie. Okay, all right. So that's the only two I can look at. So if you're going to talk, let me know. Mute yours and I'll mute mine. And that way we'll keep feedback to a minimum. These are kinks we're going to have to work out. What about James chapter 2, verses 1 through 8? James says, my brothers, show no partiality as you hold the faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory. For if a man is wearing a gold ring and fine clothing comes to your assembly, and a poor man in shabby clothing also comes in, and you pay attention to the one who wears fine clothing and say, you sit here in a good place while you say to the poor man, you stand over there or sit down at my feet. You've not made distinctions among yourselves. Have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Listen, my beloved brothers, has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, which he has promised to those who love him? But if you have dishonored the poor man, you are not the rich ones. Are not the rich ones who oppress you and the ones who drag you into court? Are they not the ones who blaspheme an honorable name by which you were called? If you really fulfill the royal law according to Scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you are doing well. And so James kind of expounds on that a little further, as he ended chapter 1 talking about widows and orphans. He goes on to talk about the rich and the poor and not showing partiality. And there again, I think that's something that we have to be very cautious of. What is our typical reaction to interacting with people that we don't know in the world? Let's say, if you go to a ball game and you end up sitting beside people that you don't know. Typically, as we sit there, I think the initial reaction is to kind of turn away a little bit and be in your space and not in their space. And I think that there's something to be said for not showing partiality, but just being willing to be available. Ryan says, love your neighbor regardless of economic status. We often talk about the homeless being the ones we should show love to. Of course, this is true, but we often judge people who clearly have a lot of money, nice cars, clothes, etc. That's a good point. And so that's really the point there, is that we have to love our neighbor regardless of what they have to offer us, regardless if they're like us or not. I think sometimes there's a certain amount of comfortability that comes with people who are like us. But if they're not, we have to be willing to pull that wall down and show care and concern for them just like we would anybody, and most often people that we're already very comfortable with. Last passage in James chapter 5, 1 through 7. All right, James says, come now, you rich, weep and howl with the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted your garments and moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you, and they will eat of your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. Behold, the wages of laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you, and the cries of the harvesters you have reached their ears with the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in the day of a slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. Those are some pretty harsh words. What do you think the main point of James of that passage there? What do you think that he's getting at in the grand sense? Again, there's always a lot of examples where rich and poor are used because that was such an issue in the first century. But what is the grand idea there?
One thing that comes to my mind is that when Judgment Day gets here, riches, poorness doesn't matter. You're all going to be at the same level. Can't take anything with you, kind of thing.
Okay, so death is the great equalizer, right? Is that basically what you're saying?
Yeah, that. And then while we're here on earth, everyone is equal at the foot of the cross. I mean, we all have sin, and it doesn't matter how much money we have. We all have sin. So
That's right. There's a Lord's Supper illustration I've used before about A.W. Criswell. where he talked about this military colonel coming back from war, and they're there at worship, and they all go up to offer communion. And the colonel, obviously very well to do, was up there kneeling down, and this poor man came up and knelt next to him, and one of the ushers came to try to remove the poor man. And the colonel, obviously very wealthy, very well known, high up in the military, he stopped the usher and said, "Nope." He said, "Everybody here is equal." And I think that's pretty profound, because that's ultimately what he's saying here, is that everybody at the cross is equal, regardless of our status in life. Chris texted me and said, partiality is not limited to rich and poor. Partiality extends to anything that makes us elevate a person over another. God shows no partiality at any level. Wealth, race, ethnicity, relationship, his only partiality is righteous and not righteous. And that's basically, that sums it up. That is essentially it. So how then does that require us to respond in regards to our neighbor? Are we too good to talk to anybody? Sometimes we make our mind up that we are. We look at someone and we've already decided, well, they're not going to be interested in this. I'm not going to waste my time. Or we think to myself, well, they don't really care about this, and so they probably don't want to be bothered. And we create scenarios that we have no way of knowing until we act upon. But in a very roundabout way, that's showing partiality. Hey, Steph. Go ahead.
I'm having to wait on Robbie to unmute me. Sorry. I want to be on.
Close to the microphone.
Okay. Going back to James 5 that we just read, I'm sure most people have heading at the top. Mine says warning to the rich, and just like Lance has said, it doesn't matter rich or poor in the end. How we're all going to. It doesn't matter, whether you've got to be faithful regardless. And I think this comes to that sometimes it's easier to think about if you are wealthy, or you have to be careful. I think those that are wealthy, or as this is referring to as rich, that you just don't sit up high on your pedestal and look around and think, well, I've got all this, and you peasants down there that don't have what I have. And I'm certainly not speaking from experience of being rich to that point, but just as far as, like it says, your gold and silver have corroded. Your corrosion will be evidence against you. It will eat your flesh like fire. You've laid up treasures in the last day. Riches are obviously not going to buy you heaven. And you have to be really careful that, looking down your nose at those, and we're all rich to a high extent. We know that. And, maybe even during this time, seeing it even more, that we have to be careful that we're not looking down our nose and thinking, well, I have this, and so that makes me better. If you have that attitude, then in the end, it's not gonna get you to heaven.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. So in regards to our neighbor, then, we can show no partiality. We are indebted as Christians to Christ to love everyone as he loved everyone. And a great many of the people that he expressed that love for in his death will never love him back. And so we have to prepare ourselves for that as well. There's an aspect to our relationship with our neighbor where some neighbors will become brothers and sisters. Some neighbors will remain just that, neighbors. And there's even circumstances where our neighbors may become our enemies. But even then, we have some commands about that, about our relationships with our enemies. And so I think there's a lot to be considered about our relationship to the people around us. But I think the biggest takeaway that I can come with all this is the example that it leads. If evangelism means anything to us, and it doesn't look like it did even 10 years ago, much less 20 or 30. Evangelism doesn't look like door knocking anymore. It doesn't look like having a gospel meeting and people just showing up because there's nothing else to do. We live in a world that is very rich with distractions, right? I mean, there's always something else to go do, and sometimes we get caught up in that stuff. But I think that evangelism as a whole is going to boil down to our one-on-one relationships with the people that we encounter, and the influence that we can have over them to persuade them because of the fear of the Lord. Is going to rely very heavily on our example and our relationship to them, and the way that we can influence them. And so that's really all I had for that class. It's 7. I don't want to jump too much into, but does anybody have any points that they'd like to make that I didn't touch on? Does anybody have any questions about anything? And then before we get off here, I want to talk about what we can do to make this better. It looks like I'm frozen. Can y'all still hear me?
We can hear you.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So let's any questions, points to make?
Hold on, Harley has a question.
Oh,
Okay.
I was reading further, and in James 5, verse 14, it says, "Is anyone among you sick? Let them call for the elders of the church, let them pray over him, anointing him with oils in the name of the Lord." What does it mean by anointing him with oil?
That has to do with it.
Not this
What
class.
is it?
Not
I
this
thought you were
class.
turning the mic off.
That's a great question though.
Sorry, she thought she was asking us. She thought the mic was off. Sorry.
Oh, it's all good. That's a great question though. Let's see. Let's see. Can y'all still see? Can y'all still see me?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I'll tell you what we'll do. But before we get started next week with our relationship to the church, we'll talk about that just for a few minutes, because that is an excellent question about what that's regarding, and having the elders pray over them and anoint them with oil. So we won't table that indefinitely. We'll address that first thing next week. Anything else about our relationship to our neighbors? This is probably going to take, like I said, some time to kind of work out the kinks, figure out, what's making certain noises and that sort of thing. And, so, as we're going this week, let's think about what we do to make,